For 2 days after Deb and Dominique left, Jill saw no trace of her young visitor, and the longer he was absent, the more worried she became. Was he being mistreated by the gruff older man who had summoned him from the picnic? The question gnawed at her, but she had no idea how to find the answer. Then, on the third morning, as she turned from putting away her gardening tools in the shadowy shed, she found Kyle hovering in the doorway. A swift perusal confirmed that, at least on the visible parts of his body, he bore no ill effects of the older man's anger. Relief flooded through her. "I'm glad you came by, Kyle," she smiled, gesturing toward the small Insectville jar clutched in his hands. "Did you come to feed Homer? I think he misses all the attention you and Dominique gave him." His only response was a hesitant nod. "Good. I'm happy to turn the job over to you again. He's grown quite a bit in just the past 2 days. Pretty soon, I think he'll be ready to test his wings. Go ahead, take a look. I have to go back to the house anyway." As she moved toward the door, he stepped inside, then edged away from her toward the bird. "I'll be painting, and Keith is gone to Friday Harbor, over on the next island. He won't be back until late tonight. Spend as much time as you like with Homer." With a lighter heart, Jill headed back to the house and retrieved her painting supplies. Now that Kyle was back, she could implement the next step in her campaign to win his confidence. 45 minutes later, when Kyle emerged from the shed, she waved at him from her easel in the middle of the meadow. "Would you like to see what I'm working on?" she called. When a swift survey of the field and woods confirmed that they were alone, Kyle edged closer. "I wanted to paint the meadow with all these yellow and orange puppies," Jill told him when he drew near. "Isn't it bright and cheerful?" He seemed interested, but he kept his distance. "I thought you might like to paint a picture," Jill continued. "I set up an easel over there for you and put out some brushes and paints. Would you like to give it a try?" His gaze flickered to the small easel about 20 feet away from Jill's, and his eyes lit up. She held her breath while he considered the invitation, letting it out slowly when he moved toward the blank canvas. Success! He'd taken the bait. Although she made a pretense of working on her own painting, Jill's focus was on her young visitor. She watched as he picked up a brush, examined it, and studied the paint she'd squeezed out on a palette for him. His first few dabs at the canvas were tentative, but after a few minutes he became absorbed in the task, the furrows on his brow evidence of his absolute concentration. It was almost as if he'd forgotten Jill's presence. And that was good. It gave her a chance to scrutinize the little boy without having to be concerned about spooking him. His ragtag clothes and dirty face confirmed once again that there was a lack of TLC in his life. But what caught and held her was the very way he leaned close to the canvas as he painted, as if he was having trouble seeing at a distance of more than a few inches. That, too, spoke of neglect, Jill reasoned. If he had vision problems, why wasn't someone taking care of them? And since they weren't, would the authorities consider that reason enough to check out the situation? But even if they did, she could offer them little information. All she had was the boy's first name. She had no idea where he lived. But she could find out, Jill realized. All she had to do was follow Kyle home today. She'd have to take care that he didn't see her. But considering the shadows in the forest and the carpet of pine needles that would deaden her steps, not to mention his apparent vision problems, she was sure she could remain undetected. Once she had a location, she could direct the authorities to his home, assuming, of course, that she could convince them he needed help. She prayed that his worn clothing, grimy appearance, and unaddressed vision problems would be enough to justify a visit. The painting project occupied Kyle for well over an hour. But when Jill mentioned lunch, he shot her a startled look and cast a furtive glance toward the woods, as if the older man had told him to be back by a certain time. With reluctance, he laid his brush down and looked at her. "You can eat here if you like, Kyle. But if you need to go, I'll put your painting away and you can finish it tomorrow." Once more, he acknowledged her comment with a brief nod. Then he stuck his hands in his pockets, lowered his head, and trudged toward the woods. Jill waited until he'd entered the forest before she went into action. Laying aside her own brush, she rose and walked across the meadow toward the large boulders where she had first seen Kyle. She forced herself to adopt a leisurely pace, just in case he was watching. When she reached the edge of the field, she turned, angling her body so that it would appear she was surveying the meadow, when in fact she was surreptitiously scanning the woods. It was clear at once that she didn't have to worry about Kyle watching her. She could see him in the distance, weaving in and out among the trees, his back to her, as he maintained a slow, plodding pace. If she kept low and stayed in the shadows, this ought to be a piece of cake. A quarter of a mile later, her back aching from her crouched position, her knees protesting from the constant up and down, as she dived behind rocks and darted from tree to tree, Jill hit pay dirt. A ramshackle structure more lean-to than house, appeared. In front of the hovel stood a rusted, older model pickup truck, and the ground around the place was littered with garbage and decaying machinery. When Kyle reached the door, he hesitated. Then, his shoulders dropping, he went inside. After waiting a good 15 minutes, Jill saw no further evidence of life, nor any indication that harm had befallen her young friend, or a tardy return. It was time to go. On her trek back through the woods, Jill considered her next move. It was clear to her that Kyle was in desperate need of nurturing. The challenge would be to convince the authorities of that. But to do so, she'd have to lodge an official concern, which would require her to reconnect with the world, at least for a while. Oddly enough, while that possibility would once have made her feel sick, it now caused no more than a flutter in her stomach, in part because her concern for Kyle was stronger than her dislike of the curious, pitying stares of strangers. As to whether she would convince the authorities to investigate Kyle's situation, that was a higher challenge. When she got back to the house, she had jotted down a few notes, put some thoughts together. In the morning, she'd run it by Keith. She wanted a second opinion, and she'd come to respect a sound thinking. Besides, two heads were always better than one. She'd have just one chance to present her argument, and she didn't want to blow it. Not when a little boy's future hung in the balance. And in the meantime, she prayed that the Lord would keep Kyle safe. Jill? Sorry to disturb you so early, but I think there's something wrong with Kyle. Cradling a mug of coffee in her hands, Jill stared bleary-eyed out the window screen door at Keith. Noting the faint creases in his brow. Although she'd gone to bed at her normal hour, she'd still been awake when the crunch of gravel announced his return late in the evening. She'd also been awake 2 hours later, when the moon had appeared in her bedroom window. And at 6 in the morning, she'd watched the dawn paint the sky a faint pink. In all, she doubted whether she'd clocked more than 3 hours of intermittent sleep. Her concern for Kyle had been too deep and disturbing to permit a restful night. When she slept, finally, she had given in to it, staying in bed an extra hour. Even so, she felt sluggish, and in desperate need of coffee to chase away the cobwebs from her brain. But Keith's announcement had the same effect as a high-octane jolt of caffeine. Her heart began to bang against her rib cage, and when she spoke, a tremor ran through her voice. What do you mean? He's in the tool shed. I noticed him as I walked by. He's sitting on the floor, and I think he's crying. My first instinct was to go in, but I was afraid he'd run off if I got too close. Her alarm escalating, Jill set her mug on the counter and crossed the room. I'll take a look. I won't be far if you need me. Keith opened the door for her as she approached. She acknowledged his comment with a quick dip of her head, then almost ran to the shed, slowing her pace only when she was steps away. Once she reached the doorway, a quick survey confirmed Keith's assessment. Hal was sitting on the floor, hunched over Homer's box, which rested in his lap. His shoulders were heaving as silent tears coursed down his cheeks. Kyle? At the sound of her gentle voice, he looked up at her with stricken eyes. Slowly, his arms trembling, he held out the box. Homer lay still and quiet in one corner. With an aching heart, Jill moved beside him and dropped to her knees. She wanted to comfort him, to give him reasons for what had happened. But what could she say? Sometimes there was no explanation for death of cherished living things, be they birds or people. Knowing words wouldn't ease his sadness or sense of loss, she did the next best thing. She gathered him in her arms and just held him. At first, Kyle stiffened, as if unaccustomed to such displays of affection. But in increments, his posture changed from resistance to a desperate hunger for consolation, and he clung to her, weeping against her shoulder with deep, wrenching sobs. Shocked at the sounds coming from a child who had always been mute, she stroked his back and murmured soothing words of comfort. When at last his crying subsided, Jill drew back to study the tear-streaked face he turned up to her. As he looked at her, the grief in his eyes suddenly became tempered by another emotion. Surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. His attention was riveted on the right side of her face, as if he'd never noticed her scars. And perhaps he hadn't, she realized with a jolt. If his vision was as poor as she suspected, he may never have discovered them from the distance he'd always kept. But at this proximity, he couldn't miss them. All at once, a memory came rushing back to Jill of the first time she'd ventured out in public after her final skin graft. Deb had invited her to lunch to celebrate and wouldn't take no for an answer. Although Jill hadn't been keen on the idea, it had seemed important to Deb. After all, her sister had done for her. She hadn't wanted to refuse. Things had gone okay at first. Of course, her appearance had attracted a lot of attention. Discreet glances, whispered comments as she passed, a skittering gazes if she turned and happened to find another diner watching her. Even the waitresses had refused to establish eye contact with her. She hadn't been surprised. That had been the typical reaction ever since the accident. Nevertheless, she had resolved to put her discomfort and self-consciousness aside for that one day and enjoy the lunch with Deb. And she had, until a mother, engaged in conversation with another woman, had walked by with her young daughter in tow. The child couldn't have been more than 4 or 5, a beautiful little girl with golden blonde hair and an angelic countenance. Much like Emily, Jill had thought with a pang that it produced an almost physical pain. The girl had smiled at Deb, but the smile had been replaced by a look of horror when she'd transferred her attention to Jill. She started to cry, emitting a panicked wail of fear as she grabbed her mother's leg and hid behind her. The scene that had ensued, played out before a packed house of diners, was forever etched on Jill's mind. The mother had reached for her daughter in confusion, then turned to Jill and Deb, seeking the cause of her child's terror. When she looked at Jill, her initial revulsion had quickly morphed into recrimination, as if Jill had frightened her daughter on purpose, as if she'd chosen to look like something from a freak show. The little girl had been inconsolable, and the two women had exited the restaurant, leaving an awkward, unnatural hush in their wake. It took almost a full minute before the clink of silver indicated that people had once again resumed their meals. Too numb to react, Jill had been unable to eat a bite of the lunch she'd ordered, despite Deb's best efforts to cheer her up. Now, as Kyle stared at her, she tensed, preparing herself for a similar reaction. But instead, he did something that shocked her. With a tentative, gentle hand, he reached up and touched her scars. Jill's instinctive reaction was to jerk back and turn aside from his scrutiny, but she forced herself to remain motionless. For some reason, Kyle wasn't repelled by her appearance, nor was he afraid. His expression couldn't quite be described as curious either. Yet, her appearance seemed to intrigue him. But why? Seconds later, she had her answer when he pulled back his sleeve to reveal a series of similar scars on his arm. except his were round and symmetrical. Like hers, they'd faded a bit, but she could tell they were of more recent vintage. And there was no question that they were from Burns. Only once before had Jill seen scars like that, on an abused child in one of her art classes. Kyle's burns weren't from an accident. They'd been inflicted in a purposeful way by a smoldering cigarette, designed to punish and hurt and control. As rage surged inside her, it took every ounce of her self-control to maintain a surface calm when she spoke. Who did that to you, Kyle? Instead of responding, he pushed his sleeve back down and bowed his head. Lord, help me get through to him, Jill prayed. After hearing him cry, I'm sure he has the ability, if not the inclination, to speak. Help him to trust me, to tell me about his situation so that I can help him. Kyle, who did that to your arm? She tried again, her voice soft. Once more tears welled in his eyes, but he remained silent. A shadow fell across the doorway, and they both looked up to find Keith standing there. Can I help? Though his tone was caring and kind, Kyle tensed in her arms as he stared up at the man, his whole body quivering. Come down to our level, Jill suggested quietly. A flash of understanding dawned in Keith's eyes, and he dropped down to balance on the balls of his feet. What's going on? We lost Homer. Jill gestured toward the box, her gaze meeting Keith's. After taking a quick glance at the dead bird, Keith gave her a quizzical look as if to say, Is that it? But before he could speak, a familiar voice floated across the meadow, muffled by the walls of the shed, but still distinct. You here, boy? Kyle stiffened, and before Jill could stop him, he jumped up and ran for the door, almost knocking Keith over as he shot past. Should I go after him? Keith steadied himself, his fingertips brushing the ground. Swallowing past the lump in her throat, Jill shook her head. When she spoke, her voice was raspier than usual. No, but I think it's time to call the authorities. You found some grounds to suspect abuse? Yes. Of recent enough vintage that it should be sufficient to compel somebody to investigate the situation. She drew a steadying breath and rose, trying to control her anger. Kyle has cigarette burns on his arms. A beat of silence tickled by, as Keith slowly stood. I take it you mean deliberate burns. His tone was grim, and his eyes grew flat and hard. Yes. A muscle twitched in his jaw. You're sure? I saw this once before when I was teaching, and I know what burns look like. Then we need to call the State Division of Children and Family Services, or social services, whatever they call it here. That's the agency that's designed to protect abused and neglected children. His quick and knowledgeable response surprised her. It was almost as if he'd been down the road before. I dealt with a couple of abuse situations in a past life, he said in response to the unasked question in her eyes. So he hadn't always been a carpenter, after all. Deb had surmised as much. Then what had he been? Jill wondered. But now wasn't the time to speculate about her tenant. Her first priority was to ensure Kyle's safety. Considering that the studio was only about 30% done, Jill figured she had a few more weeks to satisfy her curiosity about Keith. Except she wasn't very good at ferreting out information. Too bad Deb wouldn't be back for another year. Jill Whalen? Cindy Howard, Division of Family Services. We spoke on the phone. Since I was in the neighborhood, I thought I'd stop by. May I come in? Although Jill recognized the voice of the woman who stood on the other side of her front door, the social worker didn't fit the image she'd constructed in her mind of a motherly, middle-aged type. With her flaming red hair, slight build, and fashionable attire, Cindy looked to be in her early 30s at most. But more important, why was she here? Jill hadn't expected to have a talk with anyone in person. Still, if she had new information... Have you had a chance to check on Kyle? Yes, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. So much for the self-imposed isolation, Jill reflected, steeling herself for the woman's reaction as she stepped back and motioned her in. Cindy did seem a bit taken aback for a brief second, but Jill's disfigurement didn't distract her from the purpose of her visit. After seating herself on the couch, Jill waved to her. She got down to business. Thank you for bringing the situation to our attention, she told Jill. Can you tell me what you found out? The woman consulted a notepad. Some. The little boy's name is Kyle Corbett, and the older man is his grandfather, who was not too happy to see me, by the way. I'm sorry. Goes with the job. Cindy shrugged. Anyway, Even though Mr. Corbett was reluctant to share information, I managed to find out that the boy has been living with him for the past 6 weeks. Kyle's mother died a few months ago, and it seemed that Kyle was cramping his father's style. I also suspect from a few of the grandfather's comments that Kyle's father was abusive to both his partner. He wasn't married to Kyle's mother and to his son. What about the vision problem and the fact that he doesn't speak? Mr. Corbett confirmed that the boy hasn't spoken since he's been living with him, but indicated that he can speak. And I concur with your assessment that Kyle needs glasses. I recommended that he have a vision test and provided some information to his grandfather about a free clinic in town. But to be honest, I don't have a lot of hope that he'll follow through. A frown creased Jill's brow. So what happens next? I'll continue to monitor the situation. For one thing, I suspect Kyle should be starting school this fall. His grandfather wouldn't confirm his age, but I can check birth records. Beyond that, however, there's little we can do. There was food in the house, and I saw no evidence of present abuse. Cindy closed her notebook. But he's still suffering from the effects of past abuse. He doesn't even speak. That has to be the result of trauma. And he's in desperate need of love and care. A soft look stole into Cindy's eyes. I could see how much you care about him, Jill, if I may call you that. At Jill's nod, she continued, I wish we could do more, but I can't find any immediate grounds to take him out of his present environment. For now, the best I can do is continue to make periodic visits. Clasping her hands in front of her, Jill leaned forward, her posture taut and tense. Is there anything else I can do? Just continue what you've been doing. Based on our phone conversations a couple of days ago, it sounds like Kyle has been a regular visitor. And after meeting you, I can see why. I suspect he finds a kind of nurturing here that has long been absent from his life, if he ever had any. It's not enough. Jill's voice was a mere whisper. For now, it will have to be. Cindy tucked her notebook into her purse. If you see anything else that looks suspicious, please call me at any time. She dug in her purse and handed Jill a card. My office, home, and cell phone numbers are on there. Don't hesitate to use them if you need to. And keep caring about Kyle. He needs somebody like you. Long after Cindy left, Jill remained in the living room, her shoulders aslumped. How could people be indifferent to children? Or, in Kyle's case, not only indifferent but abusive? She thought of the circle of love she and Sam and Emily had shared. Emily had thrived in that nurturing environment, laughter coming as easily to her as breathing. On the other hand, Jill had never heard Kyle laugh, or even seen him smile. No matter what Cindy said, it wasn't right. Maybe his grandfather gave him food and shelter and clothing, but he needed more, much more. He needed nourishment and shelter for his heart and his soul, as well as for his body. She was still sitting there when a knock sounded at her back door. Turning, she saw Keith framed in the doorway. With a weary sigh, she rose and joined him on the porch. One look at her face, and Keith knew something bad had happened. While he'd run into town to order additional supplies. His stomach tightened into a knot. What's wrong? Shoving her hands in the pockets of her jeans, she moved to the railing and stared into the dark woods at the edge of the meadow. I had a visit from the social worker who looked into Kyle's situation. And there's nothing they can do. She gave him a quick recap of Cindy's report. It seems our hands are tied. The dejected slump of Jill's shoulder tugged at Keith's heart, and it took all of his willpower to squelch a powerful and unexpected urge to walk up behind her and wrap his arms around her in a comforting, caring hug. Instead, he jammed his hands in his pockets and moved beside her, angling his body to give him a view of her profile. You tried, Jill. It didn't do any good. She choked back a sob. You never know. Sometimes the smallest action can have repercussions we could never imagine. You did your best, and God knows that. Now you just have to put his situation in his hands and trust that all things will work out to his good. He wasn't sure where those words had come from. His comments touched her, and she blinked back tears. Thanks for reminding me of that. And then she gave him a tremulous smile. You know, maybe you missed your calling, Keith. I have a feeling you would have made a good minister. The unexpected comment jolted him, and he reared back almost as if someone had delivered a hard right to his jaw. Yeah, well, I need to get back to work. We'll talk later? With that, he turned and strode away. Shocked by his reaction, Jill could only stare at his stiff back as he made a hasty retreat. She'd intended her comment to be a compliment, had hoped it would bring an answering smile to his lips. Instead, The color had drained from his face, and in the instant before he shuttered his eyes, a flash of pain had ricocheted through them. What in the world had that been all about? Why was he upset? Questions zipped through her mind, all of them unanswered. Where was Deb when she needed her? A short time after Keith's abrupt departure, he took off for town, saying he had to walk to the electrical contractor. Jill had a nagging feeling that she owed him an apology, but for the life of her she couldn't figure out why. Although she tried to paint, her thoughts were too distracting. She finally gave up and went out to tend her garden, hoping physical labor would dispel her troubled musings. When that didn't work either, she put her tools away and decided she needed a Deb fix. Her sister always had a way of putting things in perspective. "So how's the studio coming along?" Deb greeted her. "Great. Keith is making a lot of progress." "And how is Keith?" "Fine, I guess." "What does that mean?" "I think I offended him earlier today, but I have no idea why." "Ask him." "Easier said than done." "That's what I'd do if I were there." Jill didn't doubt it. "Since you aren't, that doesn't solve my problem." "Okay." "Try reconstructing the conversation. That might help you figure out why he's upset." "What were you talking about?" "Kyle." She filled Deb in on her discovery of Kyle's burns and her subsequent call to the authorities. A social worker paid his grandfather a visit, but couldn't find any current ground to take action. "What happens next?" "She said she'd keep the situation on her radar screen, and she's going to do some digging to figure out if Kyle should be in school this year." "Sounds like she's doing all she can." "I suppose so." "She was very nice." And she hardly glanced at my face. I guess in her job she's seen it all. Or it could be that you're less sensitive about it. I told you all along, Jill. You need to give people a chance. Once they get past the initial shock, a lot of them would be able to put your scars aside and treat you like the normal person you are. You don't give them enough credit. Keith doesn't even seem to notice them. He's different." A couple of beats of silence ticked by. "Yeah, I think he is too. Look, about this misunderstanding, give it a little time. He might end up telling you what's bothering him without prompting." 3 hours later, when Jill saw a light bobbing across a field toward the house, her earlier conversation with Deb came to mind. Perhaps Keith was coming to explain his odd behavior and to offer some answers to the question that had been swirling around in her mind. And if that wasn't the purpose of his visit, perhaps she could find the courage to follow Deb's advice and flat out ask him what she'd said to upset him. Wiping her hands on a dish towel, She stepped out onto the back porch and moved to the railing. But when the figure grew close, she realized it wasn't Keith after all, but Kyle's grandfather. In the flickering lantern light, the grim set of his features was thrown into stark and menacing relief. Before she could retreat to the safety of her house, he stepped up onto the porch, moving with an agility that surprised her, to plant himself between her and the back door. "All right, Missy, you and me have something to talk about." Summoning up her courage, Jill straightened her shoulders and stared him down, keeping a nervous eye on the flickering lantern in his hand. "No, I don't think we do." He took a step closer and continued as if she hadn't spoken. "I don't like do-gooders sticking their nose into my life. How I raise my boy is my business and nobody else's. You hear? Sending the state to check up on me wasn't smart. It's a hard enough taking on a snot-nosed kid without having the authorities butting in and asking a lot of nosy questions. You want what's best for the boy? Then you back off. Got it?" "Is that a threat, Mr. Corbett?" Jill tried to sound assertive, but she couldn't control the quiver that ran through her voice. "Call it what you like." He lifted the lantern a bit higher and peered at her in the flickering light. "Say, what's wrong with your face?" "That's none of your business." "Not exactly Miss America, are you?" he sneered. "I've heard stories about you, the widow lady recluse. Now I see why you hide out here. Can't be much of a life, though. Maybe that's why you figure you got to mess in other people's." His vile words sent a shiver down her spine. "Get off my property, Mr. Corbett." He took another step in her direction and waved the lantern in front of her. It was so close that Jill could feel the heat, and she gasped and shrank back against the railing, lifting her hands to shield herself as a thick bile of fear rose in her throat. "I don't take orders from women." "Then you can take them from me." At the sound of Keith's voice, the older man's head whipped around, but he didn't budge. "Like the lady said, get off this property." Keith told him in a curt, authoritative tone that Jill had never heard before. "Now, or I'll call the authorities." For a few seconds, the man seemed to be weighing his options. At last, without another word, he brushed past Keith, descended the steps, and retraced his route across the meadow until his lantern was a mere speck of light in the distance. Only when it was clear that the man was gone did Keith turn his attention back to Jill. She was slumped against the railing, and though her features were masked in the dim light, he could feel the tension emanating from her body. "Are you all right?" The husky, concerned timbre of his voice chased away the last of her composure. She dropped her head into her hands, and despite her attempts to stifle it, a ragged sob escaped from her throat. Earlier in the day, Keith had found the strength to resist the strong impulse to touch her, to console her. This time, he didn't. Without stopping to consider her reaction or the consequences, he followed his heart. In 2 long strides, he was beside her. Pulling her close, he wrapped his arms around her in a protective, comforting hug. His cheek resting against her soft hair, Keith held her until the shoulders, rippling through her body, at last abated, and she relaxed in his arms. It had been a long time since he'd touched a woman. Longer still since doing so had evoked feelings other than simply caring and being supportive. That was all Ellen had needed from him in the end. For the final few months of her life, he'd become more caretaker than husband. And after she died, after his world disintegrated, he'd been so filled with hate that he'd never again expected to experience the gentler emotions. Well, he was experiencing them now, big time. His intent had been merely to comfort and protect Jill, but all at once he felt more, much more. Her soft, slender body made him yearn for things he'd almost given up hope of ever experiencing again, and reminded him that despite all that had happened, he was still a man capable of responding to a special woman. This woman. That revelation rocked Keith's world. When he'd arrived on Orcas Island, he'd been hoping to find many things, answers, a way back to God, hope, a new life. He hadn't been looking for romance. In fact, that hadn't even been on his radar screen. But now he realized that during the past few weeks, thanks to the woman he held in his arms, he'd begun to take the first steps toward the resolutions he'd been seeking. That here, at the literal end of the road on his journey, he was finding a new beginning. And along the way, Jill had become far more than a landlady. Although he was stunned by that insight, this wasn't the time to reflect on it. Right now, Jill needed the comfort and strength of his arms. Later, he could try and figure out when his feelings toward her had begun to deepen. And more importantly, how he was going to deal with that. As they stood on the dark porch, the stillness of the night surrounding them, Jill wasn't quite sure how she'd ended up in Keith's arms. Her cheek pressed against the soft flannel of his shirt, his heart beating a steady, strong, reassuring tempo beneath her ear. All she knew was that it felt right and good. A few weeks before, the very notion that she'd ever again find herself in a man's arms would have seemed ludicrous. Jill reflected. As with the suggestion, as with the suggestion that her private hideaway would be visited by a whole new cast of characters. Keith, Kyle, Mr. Corbett, Cindy. That was more callers than she'd had in the entire previous 12 months. After years of seclusion, she was rejoining the world instead of watching it from the sidelines. And it was exhilarating, but it was also a bit unsettling. Yet Jill wouldn't change a thing about the past month, or this moment, or this man. For as long as she dared, she stayed in the circle of Keith's strong arms, relishing the soothing way his hand was stroking her back, enjoying the feel of his chin nuzzling her hair. But when suddenly she found herself wondering what it would be like to kiss him, she gave a startled gasp and backed off. Instead of letting her go, Keith gripped her upper arms and scanned her face in alarm. Jill, are you okay? Yes, I'm fine. She could barely choke out the words. You don't sound fine. His eyes narrowed, and his lips settled into a thin, hard line as he scrutinized her. He didn't touch you before I got here, did he? His question was quiet, too quiet. No. My white knight appeared just in time. She tried to laugh, but couldn't quite pull it off. How did you know that there was a problem? I saw the light from the cabin. Since you aren't exactly overrun with visitors here, and considering the direction the light was coming from, I put two and two together. His back was to the dim light in the kitchen, his expression shadowed and unreadable. Will you be okay here by yourself tonight? I don't think he's coming back, but I could camp out on the porch if it would make you feel safer. I have a sleeping bag. The temptation to accept his offer was so strong that it took every ounce of Jill's self-discipline to subdue it. Knowing he was close by would give her a feeling of safety, sure. To be absent once he trekked back across the field. But she couldn't do that to him. Not when he had a nice, comfortable bed at the cabin. No, I'll be fine. But would you like to come in for some coffee before you leave? She owed him that at least. Not to mention the fact that it would delay his departure a bit. Did he hesitate? Or was it in her imagination? Sure, I could use a cup. Leading the way in, she bolted the door behind them and gestured to the kitchen table. Make yourself comfortable. It will just take a few minutes. As she busied herself at the sink, it occurred to Jill that this was the first time Keith had been in the house for any reason other than to deliver dirty dishes or give her a progress report on the studio. Their noon meal was always taken outside. Somehow, Having him sit at her kitchen table introduced a new feeling of closeness to their relationship. Not good, considering the inappropriate direction of her thoughts on the porch. Can I help? His voice at her ear, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath on her neck, startled her. Her hand jerked, sending water slushing out of the coffee pot. Let me do this. Why don't you sit down? Since she couldn't seem to speak, she relinquished the coffee pot and did as he suggested. When he joined her a couple of minutes later, she'd managed to get her breathing under control, sort of. I'm sorry about tonight, he said. Now what did that mean? She wondered, staring at him in silence. Sorry that he held her? Or sorry that she'd been frightened? He's a pretty scary character. When I saw that light in the meadow, I didn't want to take any chances. He was still talking about Kyle's grandfather. Okay, good. She could handle that. She laced her fingers together and set them on the table. I'm glad you came over. I don't know if he's dangerous or not, but on an intimidation scale, he's a close 10. I was holding my own, though, until he started waving that lantern in my face. Her voice broke, and a shudder rippled through her. Keith's first instinct was to reach for her hand, but he stifled it and rose abruptly instead. I'll get our coffee. When he returned a couple of minutes later, he set her mug on the table. Then he wrapped his hands around his own and took a seat. Her pinched features and the tremor in her fingers as she reached for her mug told him that her close encounter with the lantern tonight had been far more traumatic than he'd first realized. I'm sorry he upset you, Jill. I remember the night I arrived, you told me you didn't or don't even keep candles in the house. I don't use a fireplace either. I can understand that. She played with her cup, staring into the dark depths as she traced a fingertip around the rim. You've never asked me what happened. I figured you'd tell me if you wanted to. Did she want to? Jill wasn't sure. She hadn't talked about that terrible night with anyone in 3.5 years. She'd answer the questions of the authorities as best as she could when her condition had allowed. And she'd done one hysterical, almost incoherent retelling of the story for Deb during a hospital stay when drugs for the excruciating pain had loosened her tongue. But that had been it. She'd buried the horror of that night deep inside, just as she had buried the family she loved. Her life, like the home she'd created with such joy, had been reduced to ashes. Talking about it wouldn't bring anything back. Refusing to put the horror into words hasn't stopped the nightmares, however, but even they had been beaten into submission, rearing their ugly head on rare occasions these days. She dealt with the trauma in the only way she could and moved on, building a new, solitary life for herself. And over the years, the rawness of her grief had diminished. Why let this man trespass into that off-limits territory by sharing her painful past with him? The answer wasn't long in coming. Keith Michaels had not only earned her trust, he had the ability to make her forget that the scars left by the tragedy marred her face as well as her heart, just as Deb had implied. When he looked at her, he looked at her, not her battered face, and in his eyes she felt whole again, almost like the woman she'd been so very long ago. More than that, she sensed that the hurts she'd suffered mattered to him, that he cared, truly cared. And if he did, didn't he deserve to know the secrets she held close to her heart? The debate taking in Jill's mind was reflective in her eyes, giving Keith a window to her soul. He watched her battle the demons that had held her captive and apart from others for years, hoping that she would find the courage to risk stepping out of her safety zone. At the same time, he suspected that her story could rock his world, change him in his ways he wasn't sure he was ready to deal with. Yet at some intuitive level, he knew they'd been brought together and to this place tonight for a reason. He also knew that he, too, needed courage to see this through. Please, Lord, be with me. Prayer echoed in his heart before he could call it back. It's not exactly a bedtime story, Jill's uncertain tone, her watchful eyes snapped him back to the present. I'm not planning to go to bed for hours. His gaze held hers, steady and sure. Lifting her mug, she took a fortifying sip of coffee, set it back on the table, and rose. I'll be right back. Had she changed her mind? Keith watched as she moved into the living room and stopped at a long table that stood against a wall below the stairs. After a brief hesitation, she opened a drawer and withdrew a picture frame. Returning to the kitchen, she put it on the table in front of him and took her place in silence. Keith picked up the frame and studied the photo. It was a family picture. A smiling blonde-haired man, dressed in a red sweater and wearing a Santa cap, sat on the floor, one knee drawn up. One hand rested on the shoulder of a little blonde girl with merry eyes, who sat at his feet, a reindeer ear headbang holding back her long, wavy blonde hair. His other arm was draped around the woman who sat at his table, her by his side, also wearing a Santa cap. Jill. But it wasn't a Jill that Keith had ever known. Not because her face was whole and lovely, so perfect it took his breath away. No, it was her luminous eyes that captured and held his attention. Filled with life and love and exuberant happiness, they reflected a joy that had not yet been tempered by tragedy and loss. Seeing her like this, radiant and content, tightened his throat with raw emotion. Unable to speak, he simply looked over at her.